If you've got some late Christmas shopping to do, you can get that done and help this podcast at the same time by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon. And please make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. This is Tim.
This is Kumar.
And this is Tom.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo with Kumar in Melbourne, and joining us from Los Angeles is Tom Spurgeon. Welcome again to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks, guys. We had some microphone problems, so I appreciate your patience. So if these guys sound annoyed with me, like right off the bat, as opposed to halfway in,
yeah. So this guy, well, yeah, I guess we'll talk to him. So Tom has just released a huge, almost 700-page book called We Told You So, which is the history of Fantagraphics. And of course, Tom himself is a former Fantagraphics employee as the editor of the Comics Journal?
Yeah, I was what they called managing editor of the Comics Journal, which means I did everything except the news. And they had a news editor there, and Gary Groth as kind of the overall editor. So it was kind of a 3-person operation back in the day. But I was there for, I don't know, four and a half years doing that job. And I did other stuff at the company too, some reprint volumes, but mostly I was the Comics Journal day-to-day guy. Okay,
and this is like, what, late 90s?
Yeah, I worked there from 94 to just spring 99. I quit on my 30th birthday, which was December 1998. And it was a very memorable day. I remember I worked with Eric Reynolds, who is still there. He's the associate publisher there now. And we had kind of come on at the same time. And I remember when I quit on my birthday, at the time, I was walking to and from work, so I was pretty close. And he drove down and caught me before I got home. And he jumped out of his car and he says, "What did you and Gary argue about this time?" So it was, he had just figured that I was quitting, because it was, Friday or whatever. But that one took. And I haven't looked back. I've worked off and on for the company over the years, too, as a freelancer. I did some freelance work for the Journal and did the occasional interview, for the Comics Journal, and did some of their, collections of interviews and stuff like that. So I've taken money from them for a few years after I actually physically worked there as well. Mm-hmm. So
and now
they're my Fanta family.
Now you've published a book through them.
I have, yeah. I wanted to, this was going to come out in 2006. And what we thought might be cool to do a book kind of commemorating Fantagraphics that was a little bit more, kind of reflected the spirit of the place. That was a little bit messy and a little bit kind of contentious and kind of brought everyone's voices into it. So we thought we would do like a very visually driven book that would be about 30,000 words long and be about 105, 110 pages when published. And then in very Fantagraphics fashion, it ended up being very complicated and very late and very kind of have a history and kind of identity all its own over the years. It was the subject of a lawsuit. It was the subject of many angry conversations as to why I couldn't get it done. So yeah, it's been kind of within that world, or within that, kind of the Fantagraphics and really close fans of Fantagraphics, it's kind of a notorious book that people believed would never come out. So we have it out, and I had people tell me right to my face, I don't believe you when we announced it was out. So I get it. It's been a while. It's been 11 years.
So what was the thought behind the title, We Told You So?
That was a Kim Thompson title, as I recall. And in fact, when I was originally working on the book, we actually had that flipped, which was Comics as Art, ... We Told You So. And I guess it was meant to kind of reflect the arduous task of kind of making a reality where literary comics existed. And I can't impress, looking back, that how unlikely a story this is. I mean, you're talking about Gary Groth and Kim Thompson and Mike Catron, who was the original partner with Gary, who left several years in and actually works for the company again as an editor. But those three guys kind of were just, they were zine kids. They were guys that did, Gary did a zine called Fantastic Fanzine, and Kim Thompson was part of a letter writing circle with Mark Grunwald and Rob Rohde and Joe Duffy. And they were just kind of like advanced fans, right? Like those kind of fans that you would read about, like I would read about in letters pages and stuff. And they were kind of the anointed fans that would one day kind of take those editor jobs at DC or Marvel. And in fact, in, Mark Grunwald's case and in Paul Levitz's case, they did take those jobs and kind of work their way up through the company. But Gary and Kim and Mike kind of went on a different path. And part of that was doing an industry magazine, but part of it was the idea that there could be comic books that had the kind of literary ambition and scope of the movies that they were seeing and of the books that they liked to read. And while we look back now and we see all of those connections, and we see, like, Doonesbury is an adult comic. It's a comic for adults. It's different than Beetle Bailey and Garfield, and has a slightly more sophisticated kind of approach to things. I'm standing in an airport, obviously. Jules Pfeiffer was certainly doing stuff for the Village Voice, and the editorial cartoonists were all doing kind of cartoons aimed at adults. The idea that you would have kind of a comic book, that you would have a narrative that would be satisfying to an adult, was still in its infancy. And it was still in that kind of Eisner contract with God phase. And it was still in that, that idea that Gil Kane, with His Name is Savage and those books that he was doing might turn out, a long form comic that would be read along with, literary works. And so those twin kind of, poles of the company, this kind of angry kind of watchdog magazine, but also this advocacy for art, is kind of what took them on this path. There's a great interview that Gary did with the writer Harlan Ellison, with whom he had later had a massive falling out, where he's trying to describe what graphic novels or what these kind of literary comics would be like, and he can't really describe it. He kind of says, like, those P. Craig Russell is doing these opera comics, and they'd be kind of like that, but not really. And, Harlan suggesting, is it, something like Denny O'Neil's Batman? And like, no, not really like that, but kind of, just like books or just like movies, like foreign movies that we go see, or like the stuff that, so that, this idea that these kind of zine kids dreamed up and supported and found a way to kind of convince people that comics could do what great art does in other art forms, more directly and more speaking, more in a more focused way to the human condition, rather than through parable or metaphor or fable. That's a really interesting story. So I wanted to communicate just kind of this unlikely story that occurred, and we think about it as kind of something that's been done now, but there was always doubt, and they always kind of have lived near the edge in terms of the company's history. So I thought that was worth celebrating and kind of worth getting into. And so we started with the kind of picture book idea and doing an oral history, which also was kind of a weird thing in 2005, much weirder than it is now, when like there are episodes of Blossom that have, oral histories and Vanity Fair or whatever. But, back then that was kind of considered a weird thing. And I sent Gary the Terry Pluto's ABA book. And, there were a few things that were oral histories, but we thought that would be a kind of a way to encompass all of those voices. And then you fast forward 11 years and hundreds of interviews later, and some cartoons, and you have what you guys have in your laps. And I hope that it kind of reflects the whole kind of ambitious, messy, human quality of that company, which is something that I've come to appreciate since leaving and over the years.
Actually, I want to ask about that specifically, because I did feel like I read the whole thing cover to cover, and I felt like there was a narrative through line. And does the company naturally have that just from chronologically, or was that something you had to assemble and was time consuming?
Well, you want to keep multiple kind of through lines and multiple kind of ideas going. I mean, and I think what, assists that is that there is a historical argument, right? There is a historical progression or something in comics history, the history of that out from which the Fantagraphics did, which was kind of prove the fact that comics could be for adults and not just kids stuff, and not be dismissed. And it's not, and we forget that even 15 years ago, well, hell, when I worked for Fantagraphics, it was hard for me to describe what I did for a living, like to people that, my friends' parents and my friends, my hometown friends, like they just kind of figured I worked off in porn somewhere, like they didn't really know that you could have comics like that. And so the progression where we kind of have this as a category of comics, as it's, we don't, there are still some articles that kind of go, wow, comics for adults, but most people get it now. So that kind of provided a through line. And I think, what developed in the doing of the book is that you realize how many of any kind of cultural entity like this, or any kind of business or any kind of scene, is really about those, it's just this cascading series of personal relationships. And Fantagraphics, being something that Gary did all of his life, or that Eric did all of his adult life, or that is a significant part of my resume, but it's also people that kind of float in and out. It's Helena Harvelitz, I thought, was really funny in the book, and kind of her section in the early 90s about being kind of a crazed staffer there. And, later on, Jack Cohen shows up, and so you get these and all of their relationships with the artists. So you realize just how much any kind of cultural achievement comes down to those human relationships. And it really does feel like everybody's involved. And I kind of like that, I think one of the effects of reading the book is that it kind of starts to drift outward a little bit, and you get away from that kind of tight narrative in a lot of ways. And there's, you just get more and more, and people, and they're showing up, and they're also allowed to be involved. And that kind of takes us all the way from these kids in their bedrooms kind of counting out zine lines so they could measure, because they're typesetting on typewriters.
Yeah, that story about Gary typing it and then kind of figuring out how many spaces to put in the line so it would be fully justified, and then typing it again. It's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you go from that activity to, this kind of, Gary, when Gary leaves us, which will be about 100 years because his dad lived forever. But, when he'll have gone from being a kid, begging Jim Steranko to get an interview and kind of, hoping that someone would do a Doctor Strange cover, to a guy that will be remembered as kind of a literary lion, as an art hero, and a kind of contentious personality, but also just a guy who supported all of these artists. So I guess what developed is you just kind of realize that it all kind of accrues, and it all kind of builds, and it all kind of rotates, and you kind of get this wonderful. There's almost a fizziness, I almost think, to those last few chapters, where you just kind of get all of these happy kids kind of that get to be part of this movement or this company as well. And I don't know, that's not a bad place for those to be. That's that's quite the achievement for a bunch of really hardcore nerds.
Did you do all the interviews yourself?
No, Mike Dean came on and did a lot of the modern ones after 2006.
Okay.
I was not, the one thing that I did kind of after 2006 that I wanted to do was I did want to do the entire chapter that where Kim Thompson passed away. Like, I wanted to make sure that was my own, because I was very fond of Kim, and I wanted a very specific effect out of that chapter, which was to kind of cut away all of the voices and kind of reflect how quickly his life became very private again and very kind of limited right before he passed on. So, like the Simon Hanselmans and the Dash Shaws, they all talked to Mike, who kind of followed the model for the chapters. And it was kind of, at the end, it ended up being kind of a massive group effort, like a lot of Fantagraphics things, where we all kind of pitched in, and that was Eric Reynolds, and Gary was giving direct notes near the end, which wasn't really the case, I don't think, at the beginning, but was pretty much the case throughout. And R.J. Casey, who was working on some of the back matter, and then some people that some outside readers that Eric brought in to see if things were clear or communicating or and hopefully we got somewhat there.
Did you interview yourself?
What?
Did you interview yourself?
Yeah, some of those quotes that are me in there, yeah, were actually brought on were actually quotes of my own. Which was weird, but I just, what I did is I wrote things down, and then I put them away for a few days, and I took them out and I spoke them in a speaking voice so that I could have some quotes on the record. I just found that there were stories in there that were not, that weren't being covered. Not just my own stuff, but there were a couple that just I was afraid wouldn't get covered at all, that were kind of meaningful to me. But there's funny, I enjoyed, yeah. I mean, I liked that section of the book too. So I think it worked out okay. It was a little weird. I don't know. Maybe it's kind of like, I hope you guys are actually there. I'm not just sitting here talking to voices that I hear in my head still. But yeah, I did a lot of that, and a lot of, and mostly, it was all speaking. I wanted to make sure that it really was oral, and we didn't have a lot of people talking or, writing as talking, because I think that unless you're really good at that, you can tell what's kind of written back and what's kind of, and what's spoken.
Some people did seem to be playing off each other. Like, it sounded like some people were responding to what other people said. So what was the mechanical process of the interviews? Did they have access to what other people were saying, or?
No, that's almost purely and that is the writing of, I guess that's what the writing, at least from my perspective. I can't speak to all of the chapters, but I mean, especially the first 2/3 of the book, that was just kind of what the writing of a oral history was like, is you just find these places where someone says something and then someone kind of riffs on the same thing, and it looks like there's a back and forth, or, like you're describing something and, you have two different perspectives, and you can kind of put them into competition with one another kind of there on the page. So yeah, that's all kind of what it's like to kind of break down those transcripts and to find to find the points of agreement and to find the points where things break off. I guess there were a few times where something was brought up that was, I don't know, not alarming or funny, where the question that you asked someone might involve someone's previous answer, but For the most part, it was just the writing of it. You would just have guys cover the same subjects or gals cover the same subject matter. And in the writing of it, you make it sound as if there's, kind of the spirit of the place or there's a collective conversation about it.
Right. There's one example I'm thinking of specifically where I think it's Bill Griffiths said, I went to lunch with Gary and Stan Lee. And the next comment from Gary is, I've never had lunch with Stan Lee.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah, that's the kind of fun thing that you get to do. And there's things where, I want it to be funny. I mean, I think Fantagraphics stories are funny. And I think that place, it's unlikely kind of, silly. There's a lot of silliness there. There's a lot of boys living in a house kind of not working and teasing each other. And so, I mean, there is a lot of that. There's a lot of kind of denial of stories. I mean, I have a story that I tell that I don't write down that I call the trash can story, which is a story about my relationship with Gary that I'll tell at dinners and stuff. And then one of the reasons I don't write it down is because Gary just says it's not true and I don't want him to kind of like go at it like a lawyer. So, I mean, there's all sorts of different, differences and stuff. But yeah, that's the fun of it, is that everyone has a different perspective and you hope that kind of the spirit of it comes through, if not kind of, I mean, it's tough. I was thinking about that the other day because like the Image Comics has a document out, and they'll have some things out for their 25th anniversary. And even like there are things about Image, which was 25 years ago, where they can't decide like who was in the room, like during major life events, let alone like who said what and where and to whom. So as I get older, it's really interesting. Memory plays tricks on you, and so I think that part of it's really interesting to me. The other thing that's really interesting, I don't know if this is something that you saw, but I was really struck by how differently younger people present themselves now. Like, I think people are more used to being interviewed now and more used to kind of, presenting themselves or presenting a good side of themselves, where it's like a lot of like the older people, my age and older, the 40s and older, were more likely to, just kind of run themselves down a little bit or to talk about what a screw up they were. Or it was really interesting. It really seemed like there's kind of a generational shift where people get more positive and people get more willing to kind of present themselves in a more respectable light, where it just, and maybe I do think that the people that they get to work there now are much more, much less scary. I mean, you work in the 90s where they're paying you like $11,000 in 1996 to work on a magazine in a decaying old house. I mean, you get some good people, but you get some scary people too. I always make the joke that the people that worked there when I worked there looked like the lineup outside a methadone clinic. It's just kind of a rough crew. Whereas now you have like actual people that know publishing stuff. Whereas before it was kind of like, one of those like, some science fiction show where there's like a resistance of, ragtag people out somewhere. So I do think they get better people now, but I just think that people are used to talking now, and they're used to kind of getting their point across. And it's a much different, verbalization than with some of the people, even though, I mean, like, Kim's parents were great. I mean, I remember that. I remember Gary's parents were great to talk to. So I don't know. Maybe maybe I'm imagining things. Maybe I'm paranoid about the kids today.
I think that's totally true, because when I got to the last couple of chapters, I was like, everything seems very respectable and orderly. Whereas earlier, it's wild parties and car crashes and guns and explosions and lots of stuff you wouldn't kind of expect to. If you read the last two chapters first, you never expect all that stuff to be there.
Yeah, well, that does, like I said, that does kind of reflect the reality of the place. Like, I'm going up this weekend. I'm going up this weekend for the signing and the anniversary party. And if you physically go to the offices, like the offices when I worked there in the 90s, they were kind of crazy. You know, like no one really had all their like music. So there was always loud music, group music going on. And there were X-Acto knives and kind of crap all over the floor. And people didn't really have like there wasn't set up vacation times. People would just disappear for a couple of days. And I mean, there was a craziness to it. And we were all super young. Like Gary and Kim in the 90s must have been in their late 30s when I worked there. And I was on the upper end of like older people. It was a lot more 23-year-olds and a lot more, you know, people, like I said, working for $11,000 or $13,000 that couldn't stay. They just couldn't physically stay there very long. And while I imagine they're not paid really well now, it's, you know, like they've torn up the carpets and they have nice wood floors and everything's quiet and it just seems like a lot less bonkers than it did back then. And I think that's the nature of most kind of, you know, they publish Snoopy, for goodness sake, you know? And back then it was Submissive Suzanne, you know, so it's a very different publishing profile. They have the Crypt Keeper. They have these great American iconic, licenses and respectable book contracts and beautiful, like, to die for books. And it was more of an underground publisher, I think, even up through, you know, the initial Peanuts contract, for sure.
So, yeah, what would you be able to sort of pinpoint, particularly the Comics Journal, like when it sort of went from just some magazine that was trying to journal comics to the publication that everybody kind of respects as the top comics publication, even though I might still be financially struggling, but at least kind of the reputation of it was solidified.
You know, I think, you know, the big event for the Journal, I think, was the Jack Kirby art return fiasco, where Marvel wasn't returning art to the Kirby family that Jack was counting on to kind of pay for retirement and to pay to his kids. And they wanted to release some stuff, but they wanted him to sign a really kind of tough contract in order to get stuff back. And he refused to and kind of went on the offensive. And that played out in the Journal. And I think that's a lot different than, like, you know, a new Spectre series is coming out, right? I mean, that's literally like a real advocacy. And, you know, there was spillover into conventions where, you know, people are going after Shooter for, you know, whether or not Marvel is supporting this policy that they have and to what extent. And that, you know, that kind of stuff really affected professional lives. You know, today, Rick Veitch, the cartoonist, put out a new comic, and he hasn't, of his own series that he hasn't put out in 20 years. And he's been doing educational comics. He's had a fine career, but he literally just didn't, you know, like guys like in his generation stopped working for Marvel entirely because of their treatment of Kirby. And the Journal was the vehicle for that. So I think that was a really, I mean, that was the moment where it became kind of, a real kind of agitating force. I mean, I think the other thing is that you also have a kind of the quiet drumbeat of Gary's interviews. And it's not a secret that they both kind of accelerated at the same time. Gary went through this amazing period in the around the time of the Kirby art stuff in the mid 80s, where he did a bunch of killer interviews, like with Robert Crumb and the Hernandez brothers and Pfeiffer and Pat Oliphant and all these like giants of comics. And he would do these like 50 to 70 page interviews with them and really dig deep and kind of get at what they were doing and why. And he was aided and abetted by the fact that comics people were pretty good talkers, and they're pretty smart, and they're thoughtful, and they're not kind of solely driven by ego in most circumstances. And they, you know, there's especially people that were doing comics, and this has always been the case, but a lot of people that do certain kinds of comics, it's personally meaningful to them because they're not being rewarded with riches and, you know, all of those things. So it means a lot to them. And for a while, you know, getting a Comics Journal interview, getting the cover of the Comics Journal it's hard to think of this now, but that was considered like a big deal. That was considered like cover of Rolling Stone, but for a certain generation of cartoonists, was to get your Comics Journal interview and to be able to blab that Gary Groth for 80 pages while he like attacked you and talked about meretricious crap that so there was, these combative kind of great interviews. And I think just the sustained pressure, like on point, that there was going to be at least one place that took this stuff seriously, an anti-wizard, a not fan-driven vehicle as much as a kind of creative interest-driven vehicle. I think that was kind of the rhythm section to the to the lead kind of instruments that were the investigative news in the late 80s and early 90s. So I think those two they were going to take comics seriously. And as much as you might hate them, as much as you might disagree with them, you could never take away the fact that they had ambitions for comics, and they had a desire to see the ethics of the business work in a certain way. And they stuck to their guns. Peter Bagg always had that line that it was a magazine and a company held together by hatred and bile. And there's a little bit element to that too. I mean, they were contentious guys, and they believed that they were right, and they stuck to their guns. And the way the culture has shifted, it ends up that they were, I think, that they were justified, and that there is kind of this wonderful opportunity, or this wonderful way that comics works that really has literary value. And you have that there is a way to do great comics of the same type as great books and great movies.
Mm-hmm. Coming up, deciding what to include and what not to, the origins of the Comics Journal, that time Harvey Pekar yelled at Tom, and more. But first, if you value the content on deconstructing comics, critiquing comics, and To the Bat Poles, and want to help us move up to bigger and better things, how about donating a few bucks a month via Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. If everyone listening gave just $3 a month, it would make a big difference. We'd be able to reach several of our Patreon goals and bring you more content, including bringing back over 120 early episodes that have long been missing from our website. Check out all our goals and rewards and make your pledge at patreon.com/deconcomics. Or you can make a one-time donation via PayPal. Send it to donate@deconstructingcomics.com.
This is an imaginary podcast, which may never have happened.
The Shortbox Showcase.
But then again may have. About a father and daughter. I'm Professor Allen.
And I'm Emily.
Who came from Ohio and talked about comics.
Walking Dead.
Tintin.
Black Lightning.
White Tiger. It tells of their rise to glory, when the great guests were yet to be booked.
Let's put it this way, Shogun Warriors wasn't going to win any Eisners.
And the great feats of editing not yet performed.
This is Ultra 7, this is Ultraman Jack, and this Ultraman Taro, and this Ultraman Leo, and this
of how they spoke at length.
Continuity is really the brainchild of nitpicking nerds the world over.
But to be fair, the best kind of confession is the Force confession.
And reviewed in brief tales that explore creatively the bounds of a given character's history.
Red Sun is wonderful with a very strange ending.
Of brilliant creators before their fall from grace. This is the era where Miller is at the height of his creative and artistic powers, and the ability of strong writing to encapsulate and transcend its time.
Flash of Two Earths by Gardner Fox.
This is an imaginary podcast. Aren't they all? Shortbox Showcase is part of the Relatively Geeky family of podcasts. Check us out on the web at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search in iTunes for Relatively Geeky or Shortbox Showcase. And remember, we're not experts.
We're just family.
So how did you this is, like I said, a 700-page book almost, and there's a lot of stuff in here, very thorough. How did you decide what to include and what not to include?
I knew you were going to ask that about halfway through the sentence, and I'm kind of terrified because I don't know. I mean, I kind of had a narrative in my head, and I had a very bare bones narrative because, like I said, I was contracted to do, a much smaller book and a much more art driven book. But I do have those things that are important, and I do have those things that I think are important stories to tell. And I guess I paid. So a lot of it, like I would say if what reflects kind of my picture for the book is still there, like what in other words, like the broad range of things that I think are important, it's artists and the controversies along the way. There's some stuff that, I kind of groan that we maybe didn't cover. I know that, there's a couple kind of like famous Fantagraphics stories that just kind of got moved to the side. And like I said, also the fact that so many artists responded strongly and personally, I think kind of affected, it wanted me to make sure that as many people got to have their say as possible, in terms of artists that have published there. I am sure, and I know that, for instance, I know one cartoonist who counted the pages that other cartoonists got to do a comic. And I'm sure that people will count mentions and how they were mentioned and feel like they were not treated as important. There were a couple people at the company that I fought for late in the book when I read some of Mike's material that I wanted to be portrayed a little bit differently, and we worked that out. Like I thought Dirk Deppy, there was a draft of the book where I thought Dirk Deppy was vastly underplayed and probably still is. But you do those things by hunch, and you hope that people like the journal. You hope that people will at least see this as kind of a serious attempt to do something with this ridiculous, history of 400 people. And so that maybe we got the balance right. There's some people in there that Dan Klaus, who did the cover, has read the book, and he told Eric Reynolds that there were a couple people in there he thought maybe got too much play. So I expect a lot of feedback like that. I don't know. Excuse me?
Were there any interviews you wanted to get, but they refused, or you couldn't track them down?
That's really interesting. Actually, no. I would have loved to have talked, I would have loved to have talked to Ditko, because Gary and he have had a phone relationship for years, and he published through Fantagraphics and quit. I mean, I would have loved, I wish we had gotten more out of, is there anyone who blew us off? That's a really standard question that I have no idea. Is there anyone that just wouldn't, maybe and I think that's kind of the direction of the book too. I think that if I had done the whole book solo, we would have had more attention to some of the more contentious relationships later on.
Right.
And I don't know that I counted on all of those being there. I'm certainly, but for the most part, like everyone that we sought out, I don't remember anyone saying no. Was there anyone missing that you guys thought was missing?
No, I think Milton Knight is discussed a few times, and I thought, who is this guy? Because I'd never heard of him, and his comics sounded really oddball.
Yeah, no, he's a fascinating dude. If he did not get in there, that is an oversight, because he's a fascinating guy, and he was an important figure for that company really early on. I am sure there are going to be people like that. Like, I'm sure there are going to be people that we just gaped on, or that just didn't. Yeah. It just didn't. But we tried.
There's a lot of people to talk to. Yeah.
I just start apologizing I can't even describe like how nutty and weird. Like, the book was sued at one point, and there's all this kind of drama.
That?
Huh? What?
Are you able to talk about what the lawsuit was about?
I wasn't sued, so I guess I'm able to talk about it. Harlan Ellison included the book in a lawsuit that he filed in 2006, I think it was, against Fantagraphics Books, and Gary and Kim, I think, were individually named. So he was unhappy with ways that promotional material put online, content from the book, portrayed his behavior during the Michael Fleischer trial, which was a big trial that Gary and Kim and the Journal went through over Harlan's long ago interview with the magazine. So he sued, and they eventually settled. And it while it wasn't the deciding factor in kind of how the book developed, I don't think. Gary speaks very strongly to this, that it wasn't, but I think for my aspect, I think it took some of the wind out of my sails and kind of wanting to complete it or to get a complete version out there. It was pretty exhausting, and I wasn't even part of the lawsuit. So, yeah, I mean, it was a standard. A guy read something that he thought portrayed him in a way that wasn't true and sued for that, and then for a way that he was described on the cover of a Comics Journal collection. I think that described him as a comics dilettante. But that was all covered at the time. It's pretty much kind of one of the big stories of 2006. This kind of angry, into 2007, angry kind of lawsuit that was filed. And it's tough. It's tough when, some people are sued, some people aren't. It's tough when, you feel things are delayed or whatever. I mean, it's going to be, that puts a lot of pressure on people to face that. So I think it puts some pressure on us, but I don't know. Is there anything specific you want to know about that? I don't know that my memories aren't. To know about it. Okay.
Yeah, I didn't make a lot of progress. I read like the first 100 pages and I ran out of time, and I just kind of skimmed much of the rest of it. But,
what'd you think? Did you like the first 100 pages?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't known the kind of origins of it and how early Gary started doing publishing, like out of his parents' spare bedroom, and with a lot of support from his parents as when he was a teenager, of like networking with other comics creators, like in the 70s and into the 80s, and having events and. And that what was it, the rock music show that he and what's the other
he and Michael ran a kind of, they wanted to do a comic book convention but for rock and roll. So you'd have like dealers that were dealing in old albums, and then your panels would be people like Hunter Thompson and is it Ben Fong that was at Rolling Stone? And, so you have like these Rolling Stone writers that would be your panels, and a couple musicians, and it just tanked. It just unbelievably unsuccessful. And it was, they had their little zine. They had their zine at the time, which was their music zine, which is hysterical. Because I don't think Gary in particular doesn't really have a real engagement with pop music. I always loved the fact that they interviewed like Billy Joel. That always fascinated me. And I remember that Gary said that Billy Joel told him that he would never do arena concerts, and that was selling out, and like he would never. And they actually, to get like that in to see Joel, they wrote their own press passes. Like they wrote each other a press pass.
Yeah,
they signed each
funny.
other press passes, which is fantastic. So yeah, I mean, they were just kind of guys that didn't want to. I don't think they wanted, like to work Joe jobs. I didn't think they wanted to work, they didn't want to go to work for other people. And that, I think they were kind of casting around for a way to not do that. And finally bought the mailing list and subscription list for the Nostalgia Journal.
Yeah, I hadn't been aware either of the Comics Journal originally being somebody else's publication under a different title, Nostalgia Journal.
No, the great kind of Texas fandom days were a lot of comics fandom, there was a big area for comics reading was Texas, and they had a lot of fan groups down there, a lot of super fans, and a few of them had the Journal.
What really cracked me up was the story about, so Gary Groth had been working at this Newsworks magazine, and got permission to use the facilities to typeset his magazines. And then Gary gets laid off, but Tom, why don't you finish the story?
Well, and he started going back in. I mean, he had a key and kind of go back in and get work done. And the great reaction was like, imagine being caught, imagine being, arrested for like stealing typesetting equipment, like the use of typesetting equipment. It's like the nerdiest crime ever.
Gary had a key. They snuck in every 2 or 3 nights a week for months and never got caught. Because I was thinking, this isn't going to end well. And then, we never got caught. What?
No, and they found some new place to do that. Those days, it's hard to imagine like anything like closer to the vest. Like they talk about like they would go to the post box hoping that there would be money or like a check in there so they could buy dinner. That was, they were playing it really low key, and they did all of their work in Gary's apartment. It's really, it's not like there's a conglomerate out there, or, it's not like there's a 17-story building in downtown Seattle where they work now, but those were really humble beginnings, like ridiculously, shamefully humble beginnings. So, yes, we avoided Gary going to jail for years and years and years because he was stealing typesetting time there at the company. I can't even imagine. Yeah, it's just, they were really devoted.
Was Tom, in the process of writing the book, did you come across any stories that you hadn't heard before that were surprising to you?
Well, that's another great standard question. I'm glad that you guys are asking me these so I can do a better job with other interviews.
Yeah, we're the trial interview.
Yeah, you guys are alerting me to the kind of things that I didn't know. I didn't know a lot about Kim's childhood and how he got into comics. Like, there's a cute story where he was invited to participate in a letter writing circle with Mark Grunwald and Joe Duffy and Rob Rohde. And the reason was because they wanted to include some girls, and they just figured Kim was a girl. And so they invited him to do that stuff. And, kind of like, I didn't know that they lived next to Ernie Bushmiller for a while, and at that time had no interest in going over and talking to them. Yeah. So I there's all these kind of weird stories, and I guess that it was always understood that we knew about the Los Angeles days when we were in Seattle, but I was surprised, like, talking to the bros, like, this idea that, they'd have a pool and they'd be jumping off into the pool, and they'd have these weird parties with older kind of cartoonists there and the younger guys. I mean, I didn't know that was, I didn't get a sense of, well, I'll put it to you this way. By the time I got there, Gary had a kid, and Gary and Kim were not living in the office building and all of that. So to get like that full kind of in your face, the humble beginning stuff, and the kind of, everyone working all the time at that place. That was really interesting to me. And I was also impressed by like how close a relationship they had with mainstream companies. Like they would go hang out at Marvel, in like the hallways which is not what I'm allowed to do. There was never a time at which I went and hung out with like Archie Goodwin at DC. I guess I like that kind. I was surprised by some of the details. I was surprised by some of the kind of kind of funnier, rougher aspects of that life, and So yeah. But yeah, no, I mean, I think I knew all the stories going in, all the big ones anyway, all the ones that we were willing to print anyway.
Can I ask? I want to ask two questions specifically about editing the journal, because there are some stories about that in the book. One is one of the editors, not you, mentioned what a pain in the ass it was having the Kenneth Smith column in there every month or every issue. And I was wondering what your take on that was. And also the second one was somebody talked about the separation of church and state and the printing of bad reviews of Fantagraphics comics in the journal, and was there anything ever prickly about that while you were on it?
Yeah, the first one, I liked Ken Smith. What I liked about it, I like him. Like, I think he's an interesting guy. But what I liked about it most was it was like the least commercial kind of thumbs up that you could do, right? Like we weren't like like there was always that push at the time in the 90s to kind of mainstream everything and make the magazine more like, make all your magazines more like Entertainment Weekly or something. And we were running like a philosophy column from some, underground cartoonist where like no one could understand what the hell he was talking about, even like philosophy students. And I thought that was amazing. Like it was kind of like the last vestige of zine culture kind of remaining in the magazine, if that made any sense. Like if we ended up doing a TV show, I wanted to have Ken Smith like be the Andy Rooney, like come on at the end and like speak of first causes. And so I loved it. I loved how weird and kind of arbitrary and nonsensical it was. Right. So I liked publishing Ken. And I wish that he had finished more of his series. That was a kind of a pain in the butt, is that he would start these series of inquisitions and not finish them. I never understood what the hell he was talking about, but I was delighted to run him. So I thought the idea that, yes, I mean, there was always a prickliness in terms of writing reviews. And I know that I wrote a review of my roommate's book, and it was a negative review. So that is actually true. The late Jess Johnson was my roommate and wanted a book that at the time he had done. So there was that real separation. And even socially, like I remember not being as welcome at parties as like cartoonists were. It was considered like that was Gary's little weird group within the company, and the cartoonists were like a completely different thing. And I think that that's changed over time, but I don't. At the time, I really got that I was to yes. So is there anything like famous? Do we aim at anything? There's one story I remember we had a column in there called the Hit List, which was talking about like Entertainment Weekly type flourishes. And it was this thing where we supposedly talked about comics we actually like. And I get the idea, but I think by the time I got there, it seemed like it was all the guys in the office writing about their roommates' books. Like it wasn't even like, you couldn't write about, we had a rule like, not your own stuff, no one you're fucking. That was as blunt as we got it. So you couldn't do your girlfriend, you couldn't do your boyfriend, you couldn't do your own stuff, but you could do like your roommate. So I thought it was this really kind of heavily inbred column. So I thought it would be hilarious, because I'm an idiot, to do something called the Shit List, where we wrote like super hateful reviews one month. And I thought we would use the same ridiculous language that we did, and like no one would take it seriously. So my partner on Comics Reporter was an intern of mine at the time, Jordan Raphael, and he wrote this Adrian Tomene review, which was just abominable. Like we didn't mean it. Like he was called, like I think he just flat out calls Adrian a moron in it. Like it's like it was like the parody of the worst kind of Comics Journal review, and I don't think that we communicated that there was a parody element to it. And I remember Gary getting an earful from Dan Klaus at like a San Diego or something, where it was just like, and like getting phone calls from people. Like it just couldn't believe that we had just gone after not even a cartoonist we published, but just like a cartoonist people liked in this weird kind of overtly hostile way. But I mean, like, there was always an element of, like, why would you bother writing a negative review of, my work? Considering you're my publisher, that's just weird. And a whole bunch of not getting it, I don't get this. Why do you do this? And, I would take those phone calls. I got an hour phone call once from Harvey Picar when I worked there. We had written we ran a negative review of Our Cancer Year. And Pat Moriarty narked on us. He called Harvey and told him. So Harvey calls up and just talks and starts yelling at me. And the greatest thing about it was, so I taped it, you know, because I was like, this is great. Like Harvey Picar's yelling at me. And I remember at one point he said, I got to go to the restroom. And he yells, Joyce, and he calls Joyce over. And Joyce gets on the phone and yells at me while Harvey's in the bathroom. And then he comes back and like picks up the phone and continues where he left off. So I got tag teamed by Harvey and Joyce. That was wonderful. But yeah, you know, like people just generally unhappy. People, you know, but the Fantagraphics, how you would deal with that was tough. That was sometimes could be tough. You'd see them at parties. You go to a Halloween party. There's a guy you called a moron and a piker or whatever, you know, it's tough.
Another thing that kind of surprised me about the part I read of it, the early section, was how friendly some Fantagraphics staff were with Marvel and DC people, considering, like, I remember reading the journal in the 90s, and, you know, it seemed like there was a lot of disdain for Marvel and DC in the magazine at that point. There was the one column, the Fanboy Politique column, that would touch on some mainstream stuff, but otherwise it was just, like, excluded pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the interest was elsewhere would be how I'd describe it. I commissioned and ran Ray Mescalato's column that you just talked about. So I wanted this stuff covered, but it was really hard to figure out how to cover it without it being like apologetics, or making excuses for work. I was dissatisfied with the way that the entire kind of field wrote about superhero comics at that time. But yes, you're right. I mean, they were all fans and they were all friends and they were all contributing to each other's zines and they were all seeing each other at conventions and they all did know one another. I didn't know that myself when I worked there. And we mentioned him before, but when Mark Grunwald died, I remember Kim, came into the office and asked me if that was true. And I talked to Mike Harlan and it was true. And, he sat down and spoke really wonderfully about how much he liked Mark when they were fans coming up and how he always felt that Mark got his perfect job, helping to run the Marvel universe, and that he got his perfect job, which was running a kind of multifaceted company, and that sometimes, the battles that they had, which were very real battles about creators' rights and, ethical return to creators and getting people paid. But, they all did kind of know one another, and they all kind of remember, a lot of the old timers remember, little Gary Groth at the convention. So yeah, you're totally right. I mean, they totally came up together. They were totally, and it happens all the time in comics anyway. I have my crew of people. I have my, people like Eric Reynolds or Ed Brubaker or Tom Hart or Paul Pope or Dean Haspiel or Megan Kelso and Ariel Bordeaux. I mean, people that are my same age peers, I kind of feel the same way about. And some of those, I don't know as many people percentage-wise at the mainstream companies as they did, but I do know some, and I do know people that have gone and worked there. If you had told me back then that Ed Brubaker would be working at Image Comics after a long, career writing for the two big companies, I would have bet everything I had that would never happen. That would have seemed ridiculous. So.
Writing Captain America?
Yeah. I mean, they're kind of comics' greatest generation in a way. They really are.
Kumar, did you have any other questions?
I don't know if I have any other questions. I want to say some of the things I loved were anytime Hochi Anderson popped his head in to say something, it was hilarious.
Yeah.
Frank Thorne has a centerpiece, a very long thing where he gushes about porn stars, which is great. And I want to read one little quote because I just kind of reading straight through, and often I didn't look at who was making the statement, but there's one in here, and I'm going to read this. It says, Kim's superpower is that he can make anyone feel like they are in quicksand. At first, I dreaded asking him questions because Kim's answers always started with a kind of snort, as if I had asked if he'd see my glasses when they were right on top of my head. This is not the office of there are no stupid questions. They're all stupid. And then I went back. I said, "Who said this?" And it was his mother.
Yeah, yeah.
That was amazing. That was for me. That was probably the highlight.
I had totally forgotten that. That was, his parents are so. It's weird. It's like he and his brother are kind of and Mark is still with us, and both the parents are gone, and they died right after Kim. And but they were very different than their sons. Their sons were kind of classic, kind of slightly on the spectrum, kind of focused guys, and their parents were kind of like these social gadflies. So it's a fascinating family, and I refuse to believe that Kim Thompson isn't still working there. Like if I were to enter I'll be in Fantagraphics on Friday afternoon. I will walk in there and there's a big part of me that believes Kim's working 100 feet away from me, typing some memo. So yeah, those guys it's really strong personalities to get them as far as they did. And I can't even imagine running a company for that many years, that close to the bone. I remember we fired a bunch of people when I was there at one point, and it was, I remember we'd have meetings where they would start out, can anyone skip a paycheck this week? Like they were running that close at the end of the distributor wars to kind of making payroll and all of those things. And that just, man, you go through like 3 months of being broke. It sucks. And I can't imagine doing that for 20 years, just keeping on mission and keeping everything held together by sheer force of will. So all credit to those guys, man. Because it's an unlikely, weird, kind of funny, and I hope the humanity of it comes through. The sloppiness and some of the bullying and some of the contentiousness that was not, and some of the people that felt uncomfortable. I think all of that makes it a more human story. I didn't want this to be an argument as to why Fantagraphics is the greatest company ever or whatever. I wanted it to be a very human portrait of a remarkable kind of group of people.
We Told You So, Comics as Art by Tom Spurgeon with Michael Dean is published by Fantagraphics. Tom's site is comicsreporter.com. Write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or look us up on Patreon, Twitter, Tumblr, Facebook, and YouTube. All our social media links can be found on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. Also, please give us a review on iTunes or Stitcher. Our theme is from bensound.com. Last Thursday on To the Bat Polls, Paul and I were joined by cartoonist and podcaster Joe Dater to discuss the Sandman Catwoman team-up arc, the last Batman episode broadcast in 1966. What was the vision of Ellis St. Joseph, the writer of that arc, and what caused his vision to crumble? Look up To the Bat Polls wherever you find your podcasts or at tothebatpoles.libsyn.com. Next week on this show, it's Comics and Theater Act 3, as playwright Lenny Schwartz joins me to talk about his bioplays about comics creators. Co-creator about Bill Finger, who only last year finally got official credit for co-creating Batman, and The Man Who Saw Snoopy about Charles Schultz. Lenny's also working on a play about Steve Ditko, and he'll talk about all these shows next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.